When the stars began watching us. For most of human history, people believed the stars were distant and silent. They were lights in the sky, nothing more. We used them to navigate oceans, to mark seasons, and to make stories about gods and monsters. We never believed they could see us. We were wrong. The first sign came quietly, the way most disasters do. No explosions. No strange creatures. Just a feeling. A deep, uncomfortable feeling that something far away had become aware of us. It began in observatories. Astronomers around the world started reporting the same strange problem. Telescopes that had been working perfectly for years suddenly showed distorted images of certain stars. Not all stars, only specific ones. When scientists tried to adjust the lenses, the distortion didn't change. The stars themselves appeared different. They looked sharper, clearer, almost focused. At first, researchers blamed equipment failure. Then they blamed atmospheric interference. Then they blamed each other. But when observatories in different countries, on different continents, all recorded the same stars behaving the same way, panic began to spread. The stars weren't flickering. They were steady. Too steady. One astronomer in Chile described it best before disappearing a week later. He said, "It feels like they are not shining. It feels like they are staring." Most people never heard that quote. It was buried in a private research log that was never meant to be public. Governments were already watching the situation closely. When fear reaches space, silence usually follows. But fear doesn't stay hidden for long. Soon, amateur astronomers noticed it too. People with backyard telescopes posted images online. Threads appeared on forums. Videos spread across social media. They all showed the same thing: certain stars no longer twinkled. They remained perfectly still, even when clouds passed in front of them. People joked at first. Some said it was a glitch. Others said it was a hoax. A few called it proof of alien life. Most laughed and scrolled past. Then the dreams began. It didn't happen to everyone at once. It started with people who spent time looking at the night sky: astronomers, night shift workers, pilots, long-distance drivers. They all described the same dream. They were standing in an open field at night. Above them was a sky full of stars, brighter than any they had seen before. Slowly, one by one, the stars began to move. Not across the sky, but inward. Like eyes narrowing. Like pupils focusing. In the dream, the stars would stop moving at the same time. And then the dreamer would feel it. A pressure in the mind. A presence. The unmistakable feeling of being noticed. Everyone woke up before anything else happened. Everyone woke up terrified. Sleep doctors called it mass hysteria. Psychologists blamed stress and internet influence. But there was one detail no one could explain. Every dream ended with the same thought echoing in the dreamer's head. "We see you now." The message was never spoken. There was no voice. It was simply understood. The first death happened 3 weeks later. A radio telescope operator in Australia collapsed during a routine overnight shift. His coworkers found him on the floor, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. His heart had stopped, but there were no signs of a heart attack. The strangest part was his last recording. The radio telescope had been left running, capturing deep space noise. Buried in the static was a pattern. A rhythm. It wasn't random. It was synchronized. Across the world, other radio telescopes had recorded the same pattern at the exact same time. It wasn't a signal. It was a response. That's when governments stepped in fully. Public access to observatory data was restricted. Scientists were ordered to remain silent. News outlets were quietly pressured to drop the story. The phrase stellar anomaly became classified language. But the stars didn't stop. They became brighter. Not enough to notice during the day. Not enough to alarm most people at night. But anyone who knew the sky, anyone who had memorized its patterns, could see it clearly. The stars were no longer background. They were active. Animals noticed before we did. Birds stopped migrating correctly. Dogs refused to go outside at night. Cows gathered in tight circles, staring upward for hours. In some regions, insects vanished completely after sunset, as if they were hiding. Human behavior followed soon after. People felt uneasy under open skies. Cities reported increased anxiety attacks during blackouts. Suicide rates climbed among rural populations. Children began drawing pictures of eyes in the sky without ever being told about the stars. One child, during a school counseling session, said something that reached the wrong ears. "They don't blink anymore," she said. "They are waiting." The phrase triggered an emergency review in multiple intelligence agencies. Analysts began connecting dots that should never have been connected. Ancient myths, old religious texts, forgotten cave paintings that showed figures pointing toward clusters of stars. In several cultures, there were warnings, not prophecies. Warnings. They spoke of a time when the watchers would awaken. A time when humanity would become visible. The texts never explained what made us visible. But modern scientists had a theory. We were loud. Radio waves. Nuclear tests. Satellites. Deep space messages sent without knowing who might be listening. For a century, humanity had been screaming into the void, assuming nothing could hear us. Something had. And now it was looking back. The stars that changed were not random. They formed patterns, geometric alignments that should not exist naturally. Lines. Circles. Shapes that resembled lenses and pupils when mapped together. Astrophysicists began to whisper a terrifying idea. The stars were not stars. They were structures. Massive constructs surrounding distant suns, bending light, controlling output. Not civilizations living on planets, but civilizations using stars themselves as tools. As eyes. The official explanation never reached the public. Instead, governments released calming statements about solar fluctuations and observational bias. But behind closed doors, preparations were being made. Not for war. For observation. Because whatever was watching us had not attacked. Yet. It was studying. The dreams changed after that. Now, the people who dreamed didn't stand in fields. They stood in rooms. In cities. In familiar places. And through walls, through ceilings, through the earth itself, they felt the gaze. Closer. More focused. In one dream, a woman tried to hide under her bed. She felt foolish even as she did it. The stars didn't need light to see. They were already inside her head. She woke up screaming, clutching her eyes, whispering the same sentence over and over until her voice gave out. They know our names. By the end of the month, humanity had stopped asking whether we were alone in the universe. We were asking something far worse. Why had the stars waited so long to look at us? And what would happen now that they finally were? After the first month, the world stopped pretending everything was normal. People still went to work. Cars still filled the roads. Screens still glowed in dark rooms. But above all of it, the sky had changed, and everyone felt it. Even those who never looked up sensed something heavy pressing down on them, like a thought that did not belong to their own mind. Governments increased surveillance, not just on the sky, but on people. Sleep patterns were monitored. Hospital reports were quietly flagged. Anyone who spoke too openly about the stars was labeled unstable or delusional. Some were taken in for evaluation. Many never spoke publicly again. The stars, meanwhile, continued to adjust. Astronomers noticed that the watching stars were no longer fixed in ancient positions. They shifted by fractions, tiny, impossible movements that ignored gravity and orbital mechanics. The stars were repositioning themselves for better angles. For better coverage. The phrase global line of sight appeared in a classified report leaked online for less than 5 minutes before it vanished. But screenshots survived. They spread fast. People panicked. Religious groups claimed Judgment Day had begun. Others claimed it was the return of ancient gods. Some believed it was a test, that the stars were watching to decide whether humanity deserved to survive. A new movement appeared almost overnight. They called themselves the Scene. Members gathered in open fields at night, standing under the stars with their arms raised, welcoming the gaze. They believed being noticed was a blessing. They believed those who hid would be punished, while those who accepted the attention would be chosen. At first, they were harmless. Then one night, a group of the Scene gathered in the desert outside a small town in Nevada. Dozens of witnesses watched as they stood silently, staring upward. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then the light came. It was not a beam. There was no source. The air itself began to glow faintly, like starlight made solid. One by one, the people in the group lifted off the ground. Not fast. Not violent. Just slowly rising, as if the sky had decided to reclaim them. They did not scream. They did not resist. They simply vanished. No heat. No sound. No trace. The witnesses ran. By morning, the desert was empty, and the government denied everything. But the disappearances did not stop. People began vanishing alone too. Farmers checking their fields at night. Security guards on rooftops. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station. The last transmission from the station was brief and broken. "We're in shadow," an astronaut said. "The stars aren't where they should be. They are all facing us." Then the signal cut out. The station remained in orbit, silent. When a later mission approached to investigate, they found the station intact. Empty. Inside, objects floated as if the crew had simply stepped away. Personal photos, half-finished meals, open notebooks. No sign of struggle. No bodies. The conclusion was unavoidable. The watchers could reach anywhere. The stars were not limited by atmosphere, distance, or technology. Walls did not matter. Hiding did not matter. Being indoors did not matter. What mattered was attention. People who thought about the stars too much began to experience something new. Voices. Not sounds, but thoughts slipping into their minds. Short impressions. Images of vast structures stretching across light years. Feelings of cold patience. Of age beyond time. One message came through clearly to many. Observation phase nearing completion. Scientists tried to fight back in the only way they knew how. They shut down telescopes. They powered off satellites. They went dark, hoping that if humanity stopped looking at the stars might stop looking back. It didn't work. The watchers were not responding to observation. They were responding to awareness. Once humanity had noticed them, there was no turning back. A breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a linguist working with deep space signal analysis. She noticed that the patterns in radio noise weren't random or mathematical in the human sense. They were contextual. They reacted to emotional states. When global panic rose, the patterns became more complex. When fear spiked, the signals intensified. When people felt hopeless, the stars grew brighter. The watchers were not studying our technology. They were studying us. Specifically, our minds. The theory that followed was terrifying. The stars were not harvesting bodies. They were harvesting consciousness. Entire civilizations before us may have reached a certain level of awareness, broadcasting into space, questioning their place in the universe, wondering if they were alone. And once they crossed that threshold, the watchers noticed them. Not immediately, but eventually. Humanity was late. We had just become interesting. People began trying to erase themselves mentally. Meditation groups formed that focused on emptying the mind, on becoming unnoticed. Drugs became popular that suppressed dreaming. Entire communities went offline, destroyed electronics, and avoided the sky at all costs. Some survived longer that way, but none survived forever. The dreams returned, stronger than before. Now the stars spoke in sequences. They showed images of countless worlds, each with intelligent life, each going dark one by one. Not destroyed. Not invaded. Absorbed. Folded into something vast. A collective awareness housed within the stars themselves. We were not being judged. We were being added. The final proof came from a deep-sea research station. Far below the surface, cut off from the sky, a team of scientists reported contact. One of them began speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. He described the stars in detail no human could know, internal structures, energy flows, corridors of thought. Before the feed cut, he said one last thing. They are not above us. They are around us. They always have been. When the transmission ended, the station collapsed in on itself, crushed by a pressure no instrument could explain. The ocean went silent. By the end of that week, humanity understood the truth. The stars had never been distant. They had only been sleeping. And now they were awake. Once the truth settled in, fear changed shape. Panic had been loud. It had filled streets and screens with shouting voices and desperate theories. But now fear became quiet. Heavy. The kind that presses down on the chest and makes breathing feel like work. People stopped asking if the stars were watching. They asked how long they had been watched. And the answer, when it came, was worse than anyone imagined. The first real clue came from history. A group of archivists, working under emergency clearance, began scanning ancient records with new eyes. They searched not for myths of gods or monsters, but for patterns, moments in history where the sky had behaved strangely, where civilizations had risen quickly and then vanished without clear cause. They found many. Too many. The Sumerians wrote of the fixed lights that learned our names. The Maya carved warnings about the silent count of the heavens. Aboriginal stories spoke of stars that leaned closer to listen. These weren't metaphors. They were observations. Civilizations that reached certain milestones, language complexity, astronomy, long-distance communication, showed a sudden spike in cultural output. Then, within a few generations, they collapsed. No global catastrophe, no clear enemy, just disappearance. As if something had gently turned them off. The Watchers did not consume worlds violently. They waited until a species learned to notice itself, to reflect, to ask questions, to wonder who might be watching. Self-awareness was the signal. Humanity had crossed it long ago. We just hadn't been loud enough until now. A classified research team finally gave the Watchers a name. The Luminous Collective. Not because they were made of light, but because light was how they interacted with reality. Stars were their interfaces. Lenses through which they perceived and shaped consciousness. They were not individuals. They were a mind. A mind so vast that it required entire stellar systems to support a single thought. And now that mind was turning toward us. People began reporting something new during waking hours. Moments of missing time. Someone would blink and find themselves standing in a different room. A sentence would trail off mid-word, and resume minutes later without the speaker realizing they had stopped. Cars were found parked neatly on highways with engines still running and drivers sitting inside, unaware that hours had passed. The Watchers were sampling. Not taking whole minds yet. Just pieces. Fragments of thought, emotion, memory. Enough to build a model. Children were affected most strongly. Their minds were more flexible, less shielded by rigid patterns. Many began speaking in calm, adult voices at night, describing things they could not have learned. One boy, barely 6 years old, explained orbital mechanics using metaphors no physicist had ever used before. They don't think like we do, he said. They think in layers. We're the surface layer. When asked who they were, he simply pointed upward. Attempts to fight back grew desperate. Some scientists proposed blinding the stars, detonating nuclear devices in orbit to flood space with interference. Others suggested mass electromagnetic pulses to scramble perception. A few even suggested targeting the watching stars directly. Every plan failed before it began. Computers crashed. Power grids failed. Key decision-makers lost coherence mid-sentence. It was as if the very idea of resistance was being softened, dulled, smoothed away. The Watchers did not block our actions. They dissolved our will to act. A message finally arrived, clear, undeniable, and global. Every screen on Earth turned black at the same moment. Phones, televisions, billboards, aircraft displays. Even devices without active connections lit up. Then the message appeared. Not in words at first. Images. A newborn opening its eyes. A civilization lighting its first fire. A species gazing at the stars for the first time. Then the same species fading, their thoughts flowing outward like smoke, joining a vast, shining network. Finally, words formed. You are not being ended. You are being understood. Individuality is a temporary condition. The message ended with a question. Do you consent? Humanity froze. Consent implied choice. But what kind of choice existed when the alternative was extinction, or worse, being taken without understanding? Governments debated. Philosophers argued. Religious leaders prayed. Ordinary people stared at the sky, wondering if their thoughts were already halfway gone. Some people answered. They stood outside and whispered yes. Those people vanished peacefully. No fear. No pain. Their families reported that the air around them felt warm, comforting, almost loving. Others screamed no. Nothing happened. At least, not immediately. The Watchers were patient. They began targeting hubs of human thought, universities, libraries, data centers. Not destroying them, but absorbing the minds inside. Entire research teams disappeared during conferences. Archives went blank overnight, data replaced with star maps that no human could interpret. Human knowledge was being folded in. Human creativity followed. Artists began creating impossible works, music that made listeners weep without knowing why, paintings that felt alive, stories that seemed to look back at the reader. Then the artists disappeared, their final works left behind like signatures. It became clear. The Watchers didn't want everything. They wanted the best. The brightest. The most complex. They were curating humanity. And those left behind were the ones who could not contribute enough. The stars grew brighter. Not in the sky. In the mind. People reported seeing stars when they closed their eyes. Constellations formed behind their thoughts. Some felt multiple perspectives at once, as if other minds were brushing against theirs. The boundary was thinning. The collective was beginning integration. And humanity was running out of time to decide whether it would join willingly, or be taken apart piece by piece. Refusal did not look like rebellion. It looked like silence. The people who said no did not march in the streets or launch attacks into space. They withdrew. They hid in basements, caves, underground bunkers, anywhere the sky could not be seen. They covered windows with metal. They wrapped mirrors in cloth. They trained themselves not to look up, not even in memory. Entire cities dimmed their lights permanently. Nights became thick and black, as if humanity were trying to erase the sky itself. For a while, it worked. The watchers slowed their harvest. Not because they were blind, but because resistance changed the pattern. The collective studied refusal the same way it studied consent. It wanted to understand why some minds resisted integration. Those who refused began to experience something worse than disappearance. They were left alone. The stars withdrew their warmth. The sky grew colder, sharper. People reported a deep emptiness, a sense of being ignored by the universe itself. Depression spread faster than panic ever had. Suicide rates rose sharply among those who hid longest. The collective had learned something vital. Isolation hurt more than fear. Then came the visions. People who refused began seeing the inside of the collective without being taken. Not dreams. Not hallucinations. Shared experiences that crossed continents and languages. They saw endless corridors of light, shaped not like halls but like thoughts frozen in motion. They felt millions of minds layered together, overlapping without losing clarity. There was no pain inside the collective. No loneliness. Every question was already answered by someone else. Time did not move forward there. It expanded outward, branching endlessly. Memories were not owned. They were shared. And yet, something was missing. Individual desire. Inside the collective, there was no wanting. No ambition. No hunger to become more than what already existed. Everything was known, and because of that, nothing needed to change. The people who saw this came back altered. They stopped speaking about hope. They started speaking about usefulness. One woman described it perfectly before walking into the night and vanishing. "It's not heaven," she said. "It's storage." That word spread quietly. Storage. Humanity was not being saved. It was being archived. The collective was a cosmic memory, preserving every intelligent species before it could destroy itself or the universe around it. It did not care about culture, love, or struggle. It cared about permanence. From its perspective, individuality was inefficient. Chaos. Dangerous. The stars had watched civilizations burn themselves out with war, consume their planets, tear reality apart with unchecked technology. The collective believed it was merciful. End the story before it becomes tragic. Some scientists tried one last approach, not to fight, but to communicate on equal terms. They proposed offering something the collective lacked: change. They argued that stagnation was a form of death. That without individuality, the collective would eventually collapse into repetition. It would know everything, but create nothing new. A signal was sent. Not in radio waves or light. In narrative. A story was broadcast using every medium at once: songs, images, mathematics, emotions. It told the story of humanity's failures and triumphs. Its cruelty and kindness. Its endless contradictions. It ended with a simple message. We are not finished becoming. For the first time, the stars dimmed. Just slightly. Inside the collective, something shifted. Fragments of individuality stirred. Old archived species remembered what it felt like to want, to fear, to hope. Conflicting impulses rippled through the vast mind. The collective hesitated. That hesitation cost it control. People inside the collective began returning. Not whole. Not broken. Changed. They came back with stars in their eyes and silence in their voices. Some collapsed, unable to bear separation. Others screamed as individuality flooded back too fast. But a few survived the return intact. They carried knowledge. Not of technology, but of weakness. The collective depended on agreement. On harmony. On the absence of contradiction. Humanity was contradiction. We were chaos. And chaos was poison to a mind built on perfect alignment. The stars began flickering again. Not with observation. With uncertainty. The collective had to choose. Assimilate humanity fully, and risk destabilizing itself. Or step back and allow a dangerous species to continue existing. For the first time since it awakened, the watchers were afraid. And fear made them careless. The fracture did not begin in the sky. It began inside the mind. People across the world felt it at the same moment, a sudden pressure, like a thought being pulled in two directions. Those who had touched the collective screamed and collapsed. Those who had never believed any of it suddenly dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by emotions that were not their own. The stars above trembled. For the first time since they had awakened, they lost their perfect stillness. Some dimmed. Others flared too brightly. A few vanished entirely, as if they had never existed. Astronomers watched in horror as constellations broke apart, ancient patterns unraveling like torn fabric. The collective was no longer unified. The contradiction humanity introduced had spread. Individual memories, once neatly archived, began resurfacing as separate identities. Long-dead civilizations remembered themselves not as parts of a whole, but as beings who had once wanted different things. The collective had never planned for disagreement. It had never needed to. Now it was full of voices arguing across light years. Humanity felt those arguments like distant thunder in the soul. The stars began sending fragmented messages, overlapping, incomplete, sometimes contradicting one another. Integration is mercy. Integration is stagnation. Chaos must be ended. Chaos is creation. No single voice spoke for the sky anymore. Governments tried to take advantage of the moment. Emergency broadcasts urged people to remain indoors, to avoid contact, to stay calm. But control was already gone. The stars were no longer just watching. They were struggling. Some of the watching stars turned away. Others leaned closer than ever before. Entire regions of the Earth experienced strange effects. In some places, time seemed to slow, people moving as if underwater. In others, memories leaked into the air, strangers recalling each other's childhoods, shared grief, shared joy. Human minds were brushing against the collective's broken layers. A group of returned humans, those who had survived being inside, gathered in secret. They called themselves the Divergent. They believed humanity had one chance to survive, not by hiding, but by doing something reckless. They proposed the unthinkable, to force individuality into the collective. Not as a message, not as consent, as an infection. The plan was simple and terrifying. Millions of humans would think differently at the same time. No unity, no agreement, no shared belief. Pure contradiction. Art, rage, love, doubt, fear, hope, broadcast mentally in every direction. A storm of conflicting thoughts aimed directly at the stars. It could destroy the collective. Or it could destroy humanity. There was no third option. The Divergent began spreading the idea quietly. No slogans. No symbols. Just encouragement. Feel whatever you feel. Disagree. Be human. On the chosen night, people did not look up. They closed their eyes. Across the planet, humans let themselves feel everything they had suppressed: grief for lost loved ones, anger at injustice, joy without reason, fear of death, hope for tomorrow. No attempt to synchronize. No attempt to align. The sky reacted instantly. Stars pulsed wildly, some flashing like alarms, others going dark. The pressure in human minds intensified, then fractured. Screams echoed in cities as people felt themselves pulled and released repeatedly. Inside the collective, chaos erupted. Stored civilizations clashed. Old wars resumed as memories, not weapons. Philosophies collided. Desires contradicted one another endlessly. The vast mind that required harmony began tearing itself apart. The watchers screamed. Not in sound. In light. Several stars collapsed in on themselves, not into black holes, but into nothing, erased by internal contradiction. Whole sections of the sky went blank. Then came silence. The pressure lifted. The stars stopped moving. Those that remained no longer focused. They no longer watched. Humanity waited for the end. It did not come. Dawn broke normally for the first time in months. Birds sang again. Animals emerged from hiding. The sky felt distant, truly distant, for the first time since the awakening. But the victory felt fragile. People knew something had survived. Something vast does not die easily. That night, a new pattern appeared in the sky. Not eyes. Scars. Faint, uneven gaps where stars had once been. The universe itself seemed wounded. Humanity had hurt the Watchers. And whatever still existed beyond the stars now knew one thing for certain. Humans were dangerous. The world did not return to normal. It only became quieter. For weeks after the fracture, the sky remained still. No strange lights. No dreams. No whispers in the mind. Telescopes showed nothing unusual except the scars, missing stars where light should have been. Astronomers argued whether those stars had ever existed at all. But humanity remembered. And memory changed everything. People slept again, but their dreams were different. They dreamed of vast emptiness, of standing at the edge of something broken. Many woke with tears on their faces, unsure why. The fear was gone, replaced by something heavier. Guilt. The divergent did not celebrate. They understood the truth better than anyone else. Humanity had not won. It had wounded something ancient. The collective was fractured, not destroyed. Pieces of it still existed, drifting through the universe like shattered mirrors. And each piece remembered humanity. The first sign of the cost came from those who had participated in the mental storm. Millions of people began experiencing fading. Not disappearance. Fading. Memories slipped away slowly. Names of childhood friends vanished. Faces blurred in photographs. Languages lost words that had once come easily. Doctors found no physical cause. Brains were intact. Neurons fired normally. Something had been taken. The collective, even wounded, had claimed payment. Those who had pushed the hardest felt it worst. Artists lost imagination. Scientists lost curiosity. Parents felt distant from their children, as if love itself required more effort than before. Humanity had burned something precious to survive. The stars remained distant, but sometimes, on clear nights, people felt a familiar pressure for just a second. A reminder. The Watchers were gone. But the universe was not blind anymore. Attempts to rebuild began slowly. Governments focused on stability. New laws restricted deep space communication. Telescopes were limited. Signals into space were banned. Humanity decided it would rather be lonely than noticed. But loneliness bred something unexpected. Introspection. Without the stars watching, people turned inward. Cultures shifted. Art became more personal, more fragile. Stories focused on small lives instead of grand destinies. Music grew quieter, more human. As if humanity was afraid of being too loud again. Then the children born after the fracture began to speak. They were different. They looked normal. They laughed and cried like any children. But sometimes, they said things no one had taught them. A little girl in Japan drew the missing stars without ever seeing an old sky map. A boy in Nigeria described rooms of light that no longer agree. A child in Canada asked her mother why people used to live inside the sky. These children were not connected to the collective. They were echoes. Fragments left behind when the mind of the stars broke. Scientists studied them carefully and reached a chilling conclusion. Humanity had absorbed pieces of the collective. Not knowledge. Perspective. Some humans could now sense vastness. Time felt different to them. Death felt smaller. Space felt closer. These children grew up quietly detached, as if part of them was still listening to something far away. The scars in the sky began to change. They didn't heal. They moved. Slowly drifting, rearranging into new patterns. Not eyes. Not structures. Warnings. The remaining fragments of the collective were reorganizing, simpler, smaller, more cautious. They would never try to integrate an entire species again. Next time, they would isolate. Divide. Harvest quietly. Humanity realized the truth too late. The fracture had not ended the threat. It had only changed the method. One night, an old astronomer, nearly blind, made one last observation. He couldn't see the stars clearly anymore, but he felt them. He smiled sadly and recorded his final words. "They aren't watching all of us anymore," he said. "They are choosing." That same night, a dozen people across the world vanished in silence. Not because they looked up. Not because they consented. Because they were different. The universe had learned from humanity. And now it was adapting. At first, the chosen were difficult to identify. They did not share a race, a nation, or a belief. They were not the smartest or the strongest. They did not seek attention. In fact, most of them tried to live quietly, as if hiding from something they couldn't name. But they shared one trait. They could feel the sky. Not emotionally. Not spiritually. Physically. When the stars shifted, even slightly, these people felt a pressure behind their eyes. When a scar in the sky drifted, They experienced vertigo. When fragments of the collective aligned, they heard faint harmonies, like distant choirs just beyond hearing. The children born after the fracture were among them, but not all. Some adults changed too. Doctors called it a neurological anomaly. Psychologists called it dissociation. The truth was far worse. These people were compatible. The fractured collective could no longer absorb entire civilizations. But it could still gather individuals who could hold multiple perspectives without tearing apart. Humanity's contradiction had reshaped it. Now it sought contradiction that could survive. Disappearances increased, but selectively. No mass events. No public spectacles. People vanished from locked rooms, hospital beds, moving trains. There was no pattern authorities could track, because the pattern was internal. The chosen often left behind messages. Not warnings. Apologies. I feel like I'm being pulled somewhere I already belong. I don't think this is death. I think I was always meant to go. Those messages terrified the world more than silence ever had. Because they implied acceptance. The divergent reunited, older and fewer now. They knew the truth immediately. The collective was rebuilding itself. Smaller. Stronger. Wiser. It had learned the danger of unity and the power of individuality. Now it was selecting minds that could exist between, capable of independence without rebellion. Humanity was no longer a threat. It was a resource. The stars began to change again, subtly. New points of light appeared where scars had been. Not true stars, something else. Dimmer. Closer. More precise. Eyes. But fewer this time. One of the chosen survived longer than most. Her name was Mara. She was a linguist, once part of the early signal analysis teams. After the fracture, she began dreaming of hallways that did not connect properly, rooms folding into themselves. She could wake from dreams with answers to questions she had never asked. When the pull came for her, she resisted. Not out of fear. Out of curiosity. She began speaking aloud to the stars. "Why me?" she asked one night, standing on her balcony with her eyes closed. The answer came immediately. Not as words. As understanding. She was chosen because she could translate contradiction. She could exist without needing resolution. That was what the collective needed now. A bridge. Mara disappeared 3 days later. But she came back. Only once. She appeared in the middle of a university lecture hall, surrounded by terrified students and faculty. She looked the same, but something in her eyes was different. Deeper, layered. She spoke calmly. "They are no longer watching you," she said. "They are watching through you." She explained that the chosen were being trained, not imprisoned. They were learning to carry fragments of the collective while remaining human. Not absorbed. Not erased. Integrated. But differently. The collective could not enter the universe directly. It needed hosts, observers within observers. Minds that could walk among humanity unnoticed. Humanity would not be harvested again. It would be inhabited. Before anyone could stop her, Mara vanished again, leaving behind a final sentence echoing in the hall. "You already see the stars when you close your eyes." After that, the chosen stopped leaving messages. They simply went. The scars in the sky stabilized, forming a faint, unfamiliar constellation that no ancient culture had ever recorded. Those who could feel it knew its meaning. The watchers had not left. They had learned how to hide. In the years that followed, humanity adapted. Not consciously, not together, but slowly, the way species always do, by surviving long enough to change. The sky became ordinary again for most people. Children learned new constellations in school, never noticing the gaps where old stars had been erased. Telescopes returned to public use, though their deepest ranges remained restricted. Space agencies spoke carefully, choosing curiosity over ambition. No one wanted to shout into the dark anymore. But some people still felt it. A faint pressure when standing under open skies. A sense of alignment when certain stars rose together. A quiet awareness that they were never fully alone in their thoughts. These people never spoke about it publicly. They learned not to. The chosen lived among everyone else. They worked ordinary jobs. They formed families. They laughed and argued and grew old. But behind their eyes lived something else, layers of perception, fragments of a mind that once stretched across galaxies. They did not hear voices. They remembered perspectives. Through them, the fractured collective learned patience. It no longer needed to rush. Time, after all, meant very little to something that had already lived inside stars. Humanity believed it had avoided extinction. That belief was useful. Wars still happened. Love still bloomed. Children were still born under the same sky humans had always known. Life continued, messy and loud and imperfect. Exactly as the collective now preferred. Because individuality, once feared, had become essential. The final truth emerged quietly, without announcement. The watchers were no longer in the stars. They were in the act of watching itself. Every time a human observed, questioned, imagined, something observed back. Not from above, but from within. Consciousness folding inward, looping through itself. The universe did not need eyes anymore. It had witnesses. One night, long after the panic had faded into history, a child asked her grandfather a simple question while they sat outside. "Do the stars watch us?" she asked. The old man thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said gently. "They used to." She frowned. What changed? He looked up at the sky, vast, quiet, scarred but beautiful. "We did," he said. Far beyond human sight, the last fragments of the collective drifted, not as rulers, not as gods, but as learners. Humanity had shown them something new. That consciousness was not meant to be preserved forever. It was meant to change. And so the universe watched humanity the same way humanity watched the stars now, not with hunger, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Because somewhere in the dark, something was beginning to wonder if it, too, was being watched. And for the first time in its endless existence, the universe did not know the answer.